Hi, and welcome to Ivy English. I'm Angela.
And I'm Wesley.
Today we're talking about the Galileo Project, which is a groundbreaking mission to Jupiter.
好，我们的中文标题是功成身退，伽利略号永眠于木星。好，那看英文的标题呢，这个 project 就是一个计划，好，然后呢 groundbreaking 是开创性的，具有开创性的，那它有了一个具有开创性的 mission， 就是一个任务到木星。
Like groundbreaking is like when you break the ground, you're going to build a new building. So it means they're doing foundational work for a new kind of project. It's the first of its kind.
哦，那这个 groundbreaking 通常我们就翻成开创性的，但是呢，各位其实可以从这个字的原来的意思去想啊，所谓的 groundbreaking 就是破土。好，那破土通常就是为了建造新的东西，建构新的东西。那破土等于是它的从打下的一个基础啊，从最一开始的时候开始做。好，所以 groundbreaking 这种开创性，它指的是你开始的一个很大的，可能以后影响很大的一个事情或者一个计划。
And if you want to turn it into a verb, you can break new ground. That means do new things.
你也可以用动词哈 ，break new ground， 就是开创新的这个局面，或者是做一些具有开创性的事情。
So let's read the article because it's about some really cool stuff. Space stuff. The Galileo Project was a space program launched by the United States in 1989. On October 18th of that year, the Galileo spacecraft was sent into Earth's orbit by a shuttle called Atlantis. However, Earth's orbit was far from Galileo's final destination. The objective of the project was to study Jupiter, the largest planet in our solar system, and its moons. The spacecraft eventually reached Jupiter on December 7th, 1995. It later became the first spacecraft in history to orbit the giant planet. The Galileo Project, named after the Italian scientist Galileo Galilei, who lived from 1564 to 1642, was successful in recording some key data related to Jupiter, including the condition of its atmosphere. Furthermore, a number of significant findings were made regarding Jupiter's 4 largest moons, the so-called Galilean Moons: Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. Perhaps most notably, data collected about Europa supported a pre-existing theory that this moon houses an ocean under the surface of ice that covers it. Finally, the Galileo spacecraft found that Jupiter's rings are composed of dust from 4 of the planet's smaller moons. In the end, like most good things, the Galileo Project had to be concluded in order to prevent the contamination of Jupiter's moons. The project was terminated on September 20th, 2003, after Galileo had spent almost 8 years observing Jupiter's planetary system. The spacecraft was destroyed by being hurtled towards Jupiter at a speed of around 50 kilometers per second. Despite Galileo's end, we owe much of the data we now have about Jupiter to this project. Wow, it's a dramatic story, actually. A fiery death for a humble servant. A faithful servant, really. Okay, so the Galileo Project was a space program, and it was launched by the United States in 1989. So it's a space program. A program is like it's a project for a specific purpose, and it's got a dedicated set of people who are working on it. And it's usually under a bigger umbrella, like a corporation or like a government science department or something like this. It's an individual project. So it's called the Galileo Project. And you can't just call it Galileo Project. It has to be the Galileo Project because project is a noun that requires a determiner. You can't just be like project. It has to be the project. So we call it the Galileo Project.
OK， 好，那我们可以看到呢，这个伽利略计划，好，这个首先各位注意到这个3个字哈，这个 the 因为它的句首，所以它大写了，好，那这 Galileo 跟这个project G 跟 P 都大写，好，因为这是计划名称，所以3个字都要除了的之外，好， 其他都要大写，但是的在这里正好又是句首，所以它也要大写。那另外要注意就是这个计划什么什么计划，最后那个字是 project 的话呢，前面一定需要一个 the 因为我们通常讲 the 什么什么 project 作为一个计划名称。好，那在这里讲到这个计划呢，它是一个 space program， 它是一个太空计划。那launched 就是发起，或者是它也可以是发射的意思，但在这里因为它是一个计划，所以应该是发起由美国所发起的一个太空计划。在什么时候发起的呢？在1989年发起的。
On October 18th of that year, so on October 18th of 1989, the Galileo spacecraft was sent into Earth's orbit by a shuttle called Atlantis. So we've got a bunch of words here to define. A spacecraft is a craft, a boat, a ship, a vehicle that's meant to fly through space. It's a spacecraft. And it was sent into Earth's orbit. An orbit is a circle in space around an object. So you can make a pen orbit your soda can if you fly it in a circle around there. But usually an orbit means that it's under its own power. It flies around an object and it stays in place because of gravity. So the most easy thing to say is that the moon has an orbit around the Earth, or the Earth has an orbit around the sun. In this case, the spacecraft was sent into orbit. It was made to fly in a circle around the Earth, and it was sent there by a shuttle called Atlantis. A shuttle is a reusable rocket, basically. Before we had the program that gave us the Atlantis, we would use rockets to send things up into space, and then the rockets would crash down and be junk, basically. Very, very expensive junk. So people started thinking about what if we had like an airplane that could fly up into space and then back down again, and then we could save a lot of money by reusing it, like recycle our spaceships, essentially. And so we called these new kind of spaceships shuttles, and we still use them today. They don't look exactly the same, but it's the same principle. It's a reusable rocket that takes things to the space station and brings other things back down.
好，所以呢，这在那一年，也就是1989年那一年的10月的18日那一天呢，那这个伽利略这个 spacecraft 就是太空船 was sent into 被送进，也就是被发射进入 Earth's orbit 地球的轨道它被送到地球的轨道。有什么东西送过去的呢？ by 就是由一个 shuttle， 在这里指的是 space shuttle 就是一个太空梭。那这个太空梭的名字叫做 called Atlantis 名称为 Atlantis 这个太空梭，把它送到了地球的轨道。
However, Earth's orbit was far from Galileo's final destination. So your final destination is the place you're ultimately trying to get to. And so being in orbit around Earth was pretty far away from where Galileo was really going to go.
但是呢，地球的轨道 was far from 就是离什么还很远，离这个伽利略号它的 final destination 它最终的目的呢还很远。那这个是字面上的意思。事实上呢 to be far from 什么东西它还有另外一个意思，另外一种可能就是距离那东西很远，也就是绝非那个的意思。所以这句话我们讲说这个 Earth's orbit was far from Galileo's final destination， 我们也可以说它引申的意思，或者它真正的意思其实是说地球轨道绝非伽利略号的最终目的地。所以这两个意思呢感觉起来不一样，其实他们讲的是同一件事情，就是离得很远了，离得还远了，也就是绝对不是的意思。
And the objective of the project was to study Jupiter. So objective is your goal or your purpose or the thing you're trying to do. An objective is like slightly smaller than a goal, I would say. It's a concrete step in a project, or it's a concrete thing to achieve. So what they wanted to do, the whole point of this, the objective, was to study Jupiter. And Jupiter is the largest planet in our solar system. And they're also planning, their objective was also to study its moons. And a moon, we call things moons because we call our moon a moon. But actually our moon is a very weird moon. Most moons are much more like the moons on Jupiter. Our moon is too close to Earth, and it doesn't turn. It always faces the same direction towards the Earth. Our moon is much more like a satellite than a true moon, even though it is the original moon.
好，所以呢，这个地方呢，我们首先介绍这个 moon 这个名词。好，这个当然我们称它为月亮了，但这文章里面的这个 moon 指的不是月亮啊，因为 moon 它本来指的是任何行星的天然卫星。但是正好地球的这个 moon 我们就叫它 moon 啊，所以呢，在使用上，如果你真的要指地球的这个 moon 的话，你就一定前面要加个 the moon， 那我们就知道你指的是地球的这个所谓的月亮了啊。那在这里它就是指它其实就是天然卫星的意思啊，而且地球的这个月亮很有趣啊。这个刚刚 Angela 讲说，月亮它永远是同一面面对地球啊，所以它其实更像是个卫星啊，就人造卫星这种感觉。好，那我们再回来看这个句子。那这个句子有一个很好的一个 chunk， 各位可以学起来，就是 The objective of this project is to do something， 就是或者 The objective of this plan, the objective of this class is to 什么什么，就是说这个课这个计划的目标是要做什么事情啊？它达成的是什么？叫做 the objective 啊。所以刚刚这 Angela 讲说 objective 感觉起来比 goal 啊 GOAL 稍微小一点，但是 objective 感觉起来很具体，那是你要具体达到的事情啊。你可能是要达成更大目标中的其中的一个步骤。
Like our goal is to explore the universe, but our objective in this mission is to look at Jupiter.
啊，所以例如说我们的 goal 是要探索整个宇宙，但是呢，我们这一个 mission 的 objective 啊，它的这个目标呢是做到什么事情这样子啊。好，所以他讲到说这一个 project 它的目标是要 study 要去研究 Jupiter 就是木星，然后呢一个同位语告诉你它是我们的太阳系里面最大的一个行星啊，还有探索除了木星本身之外，我们还要去探索 its moons， 我们要去探索木星的这个天然卫星。
So the spacecraft eventually reached Jupiter. Eventually implies that it took a while. And it really did take a while because it reached Jupiter on December 7th, 1995. And it was sent in 1989. So that's like a little over 6 years. And that's just showing you how long it takes to travel through space.
Yeah, 那这个太空船呢 eventually 就是最后终于的感觉，它最后终于还是 reached， 它到达了这个木星啊，是在1995年的12月7号啊，所以它飞行了这个超过6年的时间啊，终于到了。
And so when it reached Jupiter, it then or later became the first spacecraft in history to orbit the giant planet. So after it reached it, then it started to go in orbit around it. And that in itself is already a huge achievement because you can go by a planet and not fall into orbit. So making the thing able to go into orbit was already a huge achievement. When I said that it later became the first spacecraft, you could also say it then became the first spacecraft. And the difference is when you say then, it's just like the next step. And later implies that some period of time happened between the first step and the second step. So both are fine, and later just feels longer.
好，所以呢，这个地方 it later became 它后来变成了什么什么啊？那刚刚 Angela 老师讲说，你这里也可以用 then 哈 ，it then became 什么什么。好，那中间是有差别的。那这个东西各位要好好学啊，因为你英文要真的要掌握好的话啊，你不是说这个也可以，那个也可以啊，而是你要知道这样子它背后是什么意思。那样，然后另外一个意思差不多，可是它有其他哪里不一样的地方。像这里，如果你用 later, it later became， 就感觉起来中间可能有一点点间隔啊，不是马上，不是立刻。但是你如果说 it then became， 那就表示好像就是下一步就变成这个了啊，所以都可以用，但是它传达的意义有一点不同。这里用的是 later， 也就是经过一番这个也许有一些曲折啊等等的之后呢，后来它就变成了这个 the first spacecraft in history， 历史上第一艘太空船，它去 orbit 去绕行这个巨大的 giant 巨大的行星指的也就是木星，所以它是历史上第一个去绕木星轨道的太空船。
Okay, so the Galileo Project was successful in recording some key data related to Jupiter, including the condition of its atmosphere. So we didn't know anything about the atmosphere of Jupiter before. We didn't even know if it had an atmosphere. I guess we kind of knew that, but we didn't know what the chemicals and such that were in it. And so that was one of the main things that this Galileo Project was really important for. But it was named after the Italian scientist Galileo Galilei. And that dude lived in 1564 to 1642. That means he was about 80 years old. He lived a very long life, and most of it in conflict, because his whole thing was that he's like, hey, you guys, you know what? All the planets revolve around the sun. And everyone was like, no way. The Earth is the center of the universe. Everyone knows that. And Galileo got actually in trouble with the Catholic Church about this issue, and he had to leave his hometown and live in exile and all this drama just because people didn't want to listen to what he said, which is the sun was the center of the galaxy. I mean, solar system, not galaxy, obviously.
好，那这个伽利略计划哈 ，named after 就是以什么为名哈，以这个意大利的科学家就是伽利略啊，以他为名。那这个计划呢 was successful。很成功啊，在哪方面很成功呢 ？Was successful in recording 啊，他很成功的记录下了 some key data 啊，一些关键的资料。那这些资料怎么样？是 related to Jupiter 跟木星有关的一些关键资料，他记录下来的。那包括什么样的关键资料呢 ？Including the condition of its atmosphere， 包括了木星的大气它的一些资料。
Furthermore, a number of significant findings were made regarding Jupiter's 4 largest moons, the so-called Galilean moons. Well, these moons were called Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. So we found some really important things about these 4 moons. And yeah.
OK， 所以我们看到说，此外呢 ，a number of 就是 several significant 重大的 findings 发现，好 were made 好就是。You make findings 就是你有重大的发现，你有发现，所以他这里意思就是说还有几个重大的发现啊。Regarding 关于什么的重大发现呢？关于这个木星它的4个最大的卫星啊，天然卫星。好，那我们就这个通常就是所谓的这个伽利略卫星啊。那这4个卫星呢，啊，我们这个中文啊叫木卫1啊叫 Io 啊，木卫2就是木星的卫星2啊叫这个欧罗巴，那木卫3叫盖尼米德，然后木卫4叫卡利斯多。
These are all named after minor Roman gods, by the way. That's why their names are so weird.
啊，那这些都是这个比较不是那么重要的一些罗马的小神，好，所以这些名字感觉起来都不是那么好念。
Perhaps most notably or most easily seen as important. Something that's notable is obviously important. Data collected about Europa supported a pre-existing theory. So the information that they got about Europa showed that somebody's guess about how it worked was true. A pre-existing theory was a guess that was already made. And the guess was that the moon had an ocean under the surface of ice that covers it. And the Galileo probe proved that this was true. I'm sure the person who came up with that was like, yes.
Yeah. 好，所以呢，这个讲到他说，也许most notably 就是最值得注意的。那这个 perhaps most notably 是修饰后面的整个句子，所以也许最值得我们注意的是，就我们所收集到了关于这个 Europa 这个卫星的这些资料，data collected about Europa， 我们所收集到这些跟 Europa 有关的这些资料supported 它支持了一个 pre-existing 一个先前就存在的一个 theory 理论。好，这个理论说的是怎么样？说这一个卫星就是 Europa 这个卫星呢，它 houses 在这里呢就是指里面含有，它里面有一个 ocean 有一个海洋，那这个海洋是 under the surface of ice 是在这个冰的表面底下，那这个 ice that covers it 就是指说是覆盖这个卫星的这个冰层底下有那么一个海洋。
Finally, and that's finally for this paragraph, not finally for what was learned from Galileo. Finally, the Galileo spacecraft found that Jupiter's rings, so there's some rings around Jupiter just like Saturn, and they're composed of dust from 4 of the planet's smaller moons. So there's a bunch of moons around Jupiter, and people didn't know where the dust came from, but it came from these smaller moons, which is interesting.
好，那另外呢， 这个伽利略太空船它也发现呢，有所谓的这个木星环，木星的一个环状物 rings 就是环状物。那木星环呢 are composed of 是由什么组成呢？由 dust 由尘埃所组成的，而且这个尘埃是来自于这个行星它的比较小的一些自然卫星上面的尘埃是从那里来的。
So in the end, like most good things, the Galileo Project had to be concluded. All good things must come to an end, is the saying. And the reason it had to be concluded, it had to be stopped, was to prevent the contamination of Jupiter's moons. And I don't remember the exact thing that happened, but I think that the thing was going to land on a moon or collide with a moon. And they don't know what would happen because the moons are rather small. So instead of letting it crash into a moon, they crashed it into the planet because it's much more likely that it would burn up completely to go into Jupiter and just become, elements as opposed to contaminants. But on a moon, it would have been a huge problem.
好，所以 in the end 最后呢，就好像所有美好的事物一样，那这个计划呢，必须要 had to be concluded， 必须要被结束，目的是要避免 contamination 污染这个木星它的这些卫星。
So the project was terminated. It was shut off. It was ended on September 20th, 2003. And this was after Galileo had spent almost 8 years observing Jupiter's planetary system. So it had been going around for 8 years and getting all sorts of data. And I'm sure the scientists who had to terminate it or kill it were very conflicted about it. But they had to do what they had to do because you can't go around contaminating things.
Yeah, 好，所以呢，这个地方讲到说，这个计划 was terminated 被结束是在2003年的9月20号。那这是在这个 Galileo 他花了将近差不多8年的时间观察木星这个行星系统就木星它的行星系统之后呢，他等于说他服务了将近8年那在2003年这个计划被终止。
So the spacecraft was destroyed. It was completely turned into nothing by being hurtled or thrown towards Jupiter at a speed of around 50 kilometers per second, which is super fast. And so when it hit the atmosphere of Jupiter, the speed created so much friction that it basically burnt up.
好，所以呢，这个太空船呢 was destroyed 被摧毁。怎么摧毁呢？它是 being hurtled。这个 hurtle 就是猛冲尤其是指很危险的这样直接冲下去，速度很高的猛冲，所以它是被猛冲朝着什么很快的撞下去呢？朝着木星撞下去。at a speed of 它的速度是大概每秒钟50公里所以速度非常快往木星撞过去，那很可能在这个木星的大气层里面就被烧掉了。
So despite Galileo's end, despite the fact that the project had to end, we owe much of the data we now have about Jupiter to this project. So we owe the data to this project. So we owe Galileo for this data.
好，所以 owe something to 某人或某事，就是 something 必须要归功于某人或某事。所以他说，尽管这个计划它最后是这样结束了，但是呢，我们现在有的关于木星的很多的资料都必须要归功于这一次的计划。
Okay, so now we have to find out, what did you learn? What did you learn? Well, number one, we're going to ask you, approximately how many years did it take the Galileo spacecraft to travel from Earth to Jupiter?
好，所以呢，这个伽利略太空船从地球到木星大概花了多少时间呢？
6 years.
答案是差不多6年。
And number two, why did the Galileo Project need to be brought to an end?
为什么伽利略计划必须要让它结束呢？
And the answer is in order to prevent the contamination of Jupiter's moons.
答案是为了要避免污染到木星的卫星。
Okay, so that's all we have for you today, but please come again tomorrow or the next time for more Ivy English. Until then, bye-bye.